The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly beneath a pitiless sun that had baked the earth hard as brick for 3 months without relief. Cole Mackenzie rode his sorrel gelding along what had once been Cottonwood Creek, now nothing more than a chain of cracked mud pools that reflected the cloudless sky like broken mirrors. At 38, Cole had weathered many droughts during his years as a cowhand and small-time rancher, but this one was different, deeper, more persistent, and more destructive than anything he'd experienced. His small spread, tucked into a valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement, had sustained him for 8 years through good times and bad. The modest cabin he'd built with his own hands, the corrals that held his 20 head of cattle, and the well that had never failed to provide sweet water, all of it now seemed as fragile as a house of cards in the face of the relentless drought. The well that had been his salvation was dropping daily. What had once been 40 feet of reliable water was now down to barely 10 feet, and Cole could see the sandy bottom through the murky liquid that remained. His cattle, already lean from sparse grazing, were showing signs of serious dehydration despite his efforts to ration the precious water. It was while checking his dwindling water supply that Cole first heard the sound that would change everything. A child's cry, thin and desperate, carried on the hot wind from somewhere beyond the ridge that marked his property line. In this empty country, where his nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, the sound of a child in distress was as unexpected as it was alarming. Following the sound, Cole guided his horse up the rocky slope that separated his valley from the badlands beyond. The terrain quickly became rougher, with twisted junipers and scattered boulders providing the only shade in a landscape that seemed designed to punish any living thing foolish enough to venture there during the heat of the day. He found her in a narrow arroyo where flash floods had carved deep channels through the red earth, a girl of perhaps 7 years, with the dark hair and features that marked her as one of the Apache people who still moved through this country, despite the government's efforts to confine them to reservations. She was unconscious from heat and dehydration, her small body curled beneath the meager shade of an overhanging rock. Cole dismounted and knelt beside the child, checking for signs of life with the gentle care he might have shown his own daughter, if he'd been blessed with children. Her pulse was rapid and weak, her skin hot and dry to the touch, and her lips were cracked from thirst. She was perhaps hours away from death, if something wasn't done immediately. Without hesitation, Cole lifted the child and placed her across his saddle, using his own body to shield her from the punishing sun as he rode back toward his cabin. Every drop of water he gave her would be one less drop for his cattle or himself, but the arithmetic of survival took second place to the simple human obligation to help someone in desperate need. The girl remained unconscious as Cole carried her into his cabin and laid her on his own bed, the coolest place he could provide in a dwelling that offered little relief from the heat. He gave her water drop by drop, letting it trickle between her parched lips while monitoring her breathing and checking for signs of improvement. The child, who Cole learned was called Aiyana, meaning eternal blossom, regained consciousness as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that mocked the drought-stricken land below. Her dark eyes opened slowly, filled with confusion and fear as she found herself in an unfamiliar place surrounded by the belongings of a white man. "Easy there, little one," Cole said gently, using the same tone he employed when gentling wild horses. "You're safe now. You were sick from the heat, but you're going to be all right." Aiyana's English was limited, but her intelligence was evident as she quickly assessed her situation and realized that this stranger had helped rather than harmed her. When Cole offered her more water, she drank gratefully, her body's desperate need overcoming her cultural wariness of accepting aid from potential enemies. Through a combination of simple English, gestures, and a few Spanish words they both understood, Cole learned that Aiyana had become separated from her family during a sandstorm 2 days earlier. She'd been wandering in the Badlands ever since, searching for her people while the merciless sun slowly drained the life from her small body. "My grandfather is Eagle Feather," she managed to communicate, using a mixture of words and gestures. "Big Chief. My people. They look for me." Cole nodded, understanding both the child's situation and the complexity it created for him. Apache bands still moved through this territory despite government efforts to relocate them to distant reservations, and relations between the remaining Apache and white settlers were tense at best. Finding a lost Apache child and caring for her could be seen as either a humanitarian act or evidence of collaboration with hostile Indians, depending on who was doing the judging. But looking at Aiyana's trusting face as she accepted food and comfort from a stranger, Cole knew that political considerations were secondary to basic human decency. This was a child in need, and he would help her regardless of the potential consequences. Over the next 2 days, as Aiyana recovered her strength and Cole searched for signs of her family, the drought continued its relentless assault on the land. His well dropped another foot, his cattle grew more desperate, and the few remaining green things in his valley withered beneath the unforgiving sun. Cole found himself rationing water more strictly than ever, giving Aiyana what she needed while trying to maintain his livestock and keep his own body functioning in the brutal heat. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly grim at the current rate of consumption. His well would run dry within 2 weeks. It was on the third morning that Cole woke to find Aiyana standing by his window, pointing excitedly toward the eastern ridge where dust clouds marked the approach of riders. Her family had found her, following tracks and signs that were invisible to Cole's untrained eyes but clear as writing to people who'd spent their lives reading the language of the desert. The Apache band that appeared on Cole's property consisted of about 20 people, men, women, and children, on horses and on foot, led by an elderly man whose bearing and ornamentation marked him as the chief Aiyana had spoken of. Eagle Feather was a man of perhaps 70 winters, his weathered face bearing the wisdom and authority of someone who'd guided his people through decades of conflict and change. The reunion between Aiyana and her family was joyful but brief, with tears and embraces quickly giving way to serious conversations in rapid Apache between the child and the adults. Cole stood respectfully aside, understanding that he was witnessing something private and sacred despite taking place on his own property. Eagle Feather approached Cole with the careful dignity that marked all his movements, his dark eyes assessing this white man who'd shown kindness to his granddaughter. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, learned during years of dealing with government agents and military officials. "My granddaughter tells me you found her dying in the desert and brought her back to life with your water and care. This creates a debt that must be acknowledged." Cole shook his head, uncomfortable with the formal nature of the chief's gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same thing, Chief. She's just a child who needed help." Eagle Feather smiled at Cole's modesty, but his expression remained serious. "You do not understand, Cole Mackenzie. In our way, when someone saves the life of a chief's granddaughter, they become family. What threatens you now threatens us as well." The implications of the chief's words became clearer as the Apache band made camp near Cole's property for the night. Through conversations with Eagle Feather and some of the younger warriors who spoke better English, Cole learned that the Apache people had been watching the drought's effects on the white settlements with growing concern. "The earth is dying," Eagle Feather explained as they shared a meal around the Apache campfire. "The white man's way of taking water from the ground without giving anything back has angered the spirits that control the rains. Unless the balance is restored, this drought will continue until everything dies." Cole listened respectfully to the chief's explanation, though his practical Western mind struggled with the spiritual implications of what he was hearing. To him, the drought was a natural phenomenon that would eventually end, though it might destroy his livelihood in the process. To Eagle Feather, it was a symptom of a deeper problem that required both understanding and action to resolve. "You have shown honor to our people," the chief continued. "But more than that, you have shown respect for life itself by saving my granddaughter without thought of reward. Such actions please the spirits and mark you as someone who understands the proper relationship between humans and the natural world." The next morning brought no relief from the heat, and Cole's well showed another alarming drop in water level. As the Apache band prepared to continue their journey, Eagle Feather pulled Cole aside for a private conversation that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "In 7 days, when the moon is dark, come to the place where 3 red rocks stand together in the canyon north of your land. Come alone, and bring only what water you need for the journey. What you find there will determine whether you survive this drought or perish with your cattle." The chief's words carried the weight of prophecy, though Cole wasn't sure whether to interpret them as mystical guidance or practical advice from people who knew the desert better than any white man ever could. Either way, Eagle Feather had never spoken anything but truth during their brief acquaintance. As the Apache band disappeared into the shimmering heat, Cole found himself alone again with his dwindling water supply and his growing desperation. The cattle were showing serious signs of stress, and he'd been forced to start making plans for their sale or slaughter before they died of thirst. But Eagle Feather's words echoed in his mind, and despite his skeptical nature, Cole found himself counting the days until the dark moon and wondering what he might find at the place where 3 red rocks stood together in the northern canyon. The 7 days that followed Eagle Feather's departure were the hardest Cole had ever endured. The drought intensified with each passing day, as if nature itself was determined to squeeze every drop of moisture from the suffering land. His well dropped to barely 6 feet of increasingly murky water, and 2 of his cattle died despite his efforts to keep them alive. Cole spent his mornings hauling water in buckets, trying to distribute the precious liquid among his remaining animals while conserving enough for his own survival. His afternoons were spent in whatever shade he could find, waiting for the sun to lose some of its killing power before venturing out again. The nights brought no relief from the heat, just a different kind of torment as Cole listened to his cattle lowing in distress and calculated how many more days his water would last. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams of rain that never came, and wells that ran dry while he watched helplessly. On the 6th night, Cole made his decision. Whether Eagle Feather's words represented genuine spiritual guidance or simply the advice of people who knew hidden water sources, he had nothing to lose by following the chief's instructions. His current situation was unsustainable within days. He'd be facing the same death by dehydration that had nearly claimed little Aiyana. The morning of the dark moon found Cole saddling his horse before dawn, carrying only a single canteen of water and enough food for a day's journey. His remaining cattle watched with dull eyes as he rode away, too exhausted by heat and thirst to show much interest in his departure. The ride north took him through country he'd never explored thoroughly, following game trails and natural landmarks toward the canyon Eagle Feather had described. The landscape grew increasingly rugged as he traveled, with red sandstone formations rising like ancient monuments from the desert floor. It was near midday when Cole found the place where 3 red rocks stood together, massive stone pillars that had been carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed almost deliberately arranged. They stood at the entrance to a narrow canyon that cut deep into the surrounding mesa, their surfaces decorated with pictographs that spoke of human presence, stretching back far beyond recorded history. Cole dismounted and approached the rock formation cautiously, unsure what he was supposed to find or do. The silence was complete except for the whisper of hot wind through the stone passages, and the temperature in the canyon was actually cooler than the open desert he'd left behind. It was then that he heard a sound so unexpected that he almost dismissed it as desert hallucination. Somewhere in the depths of the canyon, water was running, not the trickle of a dying stream, but the steady flow of a substantial creek that seemed impossible in this drought-stricken landscape. Following the sound deeper into the canyon, Cole discovered something that defied his understanding of the local geography. A spring emerged from the rock wall about 50 feet above the canyon floor, feeding a series of natural pools that overflowed into a clear stream running toward the heart of the mesa. But this wasn't just any desert spring, it was a substantial water source surrounded by lush vegetation that seemed to exist in a different climate entirely. Cottonwood trees provided shade, while grass and wildflowers created patches of green that looked like mirages made real. More importantly, Cole wasn't alone in the canyon. Eagle Feather sat beside one of the larger pools, accompanied by several other Apache elders who regarded Cole's arrival with the satisfaction of people whose predictions had been confirmed. "You came," Eagle Feather said simply. "This shows that you truly understand the value of what we offered." The sacred spring that Cole had discovered represented more than just a source of water. It was the heart of Apache spiritual traditions that stretched back centuries before white settlers had arrived in the territory. Eagle Feather and the elders who accompanied him explained that the spring had been protected and preserved by their people, as both a practical resource and a sacred site. "The spirits of water live here," Eagle Feather said as he led Cole around the various pools and channels that made up the spring system. "Our people have been guardians of this place since the beginning of memory, ensuring that it remains pure and available for those who approach with proper respect." Cole learned that the Apache had been watching the effects of the drought on white settlements throughout the region, understanding that the crisis was part of a larger pattern of environmental disruption caused by practices that didn't account for the desert's natural limits. White men dig wells everywhere, pump water from underground rivers that took thousands of years to fill, and wonder why the land dies when those rivers run dry, explained Grey Wolf, one of the Apache elders. "They take without giving back, use without understanding the consequences." The spring system that Cole was seeing had been maintained through traditional practices that ensured its continued productivity even during severe droughts. The Apache had learned to work with natural water cycles rather than against them, taking only what they needed and protecting the source from contamination or overuse. "This water could save your ranch and your cattle," Eagle Feather said as they sat beside the main pool, watching small fish swim in the crystal-clear water. "But it comes with obligations that you must understand and accept." The obligations weren't onerous, but they required Cole to think about water management in ways that were foreign to his experience. He would need to transport water carefully to avoid waste, use only what was necessary for survival, and most importantly, protect the location and nature of the spring from anyone who might exploit it carelessly. Too many people knowing about this place would destroy it, Grey Wolf explained. White men would bring machines, build dams, try to capture all the water at once. Within a few years, the spring would die and the desert would reclaim this canyon. Cole understood the dilemma. The Apache were offering him salvation, but only if he could accept the responsibility that came with access to such a precious resource. It wasn't just about taking water, it was about becoming part of a tradition of stewardship that had preserved the spring for countless generations. The practical arrangements for transporting water from the spring to Cole's ranch required ingenuity and careful planning. The Apache showed him how to build a travois that could carry large containers of water without overtaxing his horse, and they taught him the best routes between the canyon and his property. More importantly, they showed him traditional methods for storing and conserving water that would make every gallon more effective than anything he'd achieved with conventional techniques. Adobe cisterns that minimized evaporation, gravity-fed irrigation systems that delivered water directly to plant roots, and techniques for recycling water through multiple uses. These methods have sustained our people through droughts that lasted many years, Eagle Feather said as they demonstrated the construction techniques. They will sustain you as well, if you use them wisely. The first load of water that Cole transported from the sacred spring was like liquid gold, immediately reviving his most distressed cattle and allowing him to begin implementing the conservation techniques he'd learned. But more than the physical relief, he felt the psychological transformation that came with knowing he had access to a reliable water source. The arrangement that developed between Cole and the Apache band was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the territory. Every few days, Cole would make the journey to the sacred spring, transporting water back to his ranch while learning more about traditional water management and desert survival techniques. The Apache elders became his teachers in ways that went far beyond water conservation. They showed him how to read weather signs that could predict rain days in advance, how to identify plants that could provide food and medicine during dry periods, and how to modify his ranching practices to work with desert conditions rather than fighting against them. Your cattle are dying because you try to make them live like cattle in green country, Grey Wolf explained during one of Cole's visits to the spring. Desert cattle must learn to graze differently, move differently, drink differently. We will show you how to teach them. The transformation of Cole's ranch was gradual, but dramatic. His cattle, sustained by regular water deliveries and managed according to traditional Apache practices, began to show signs of adaptation to the harsh conditions. They learned to graze in the cooler hours, seek shade during the worst heat, and make more efficient use of the water they received. Cole found himself becoming fluent in Apache practices that had evolved over centuries of desert living. He learned to track seasonal patterns that were invisible to most white settlers, to identify subtle changes in plant and animal behavior that indicated weather changes, and to work with natural cycles rather than imposing artificial schedules. But perhaps most importantly, he developed relationships within the Apache community that went far beyond the practical arrangements surrounding the sacred spring. Eagle Feather's extended family began to include Cole in social gatherings and ceremonial events, treating him as an honorary member of the tribe who'd proven his worthiness through his care for Aiyana and his respect for their traditions. Aiyana herself became a frequent visitor to Cole's ranch, serving as both student and teacher as she learned English while helping Cole improve his Apache language skills. The child who'd been near death when he found her grew into a confident young girl who moved easily between both cultures. "Uncle Cole," she said one evening as they watched the sunset from his porch, using the Apache term of respect for a trusted family friend, "My grandfather says the rains will come soon. The spirits are pleased with how you have used their gift of water." Eagle Feather's weather predictions proved accurate. After 4 months of devastating drought, the rains finally came in the form of massive thunderstorms that filled arroyos, replenished natural water sources, and brought the desert briefly back to life. But the drought had changed Cole's understanding of his relationship with the land in ways that would influence the rest of his life. He continued to visit the sacred spring regularly, maintaining his connection with the Apache community and continuing to learn from their accumulated wisdom about desert survival. The water conservation techniques he'd learned proved valuable even after natural water sources recovered. His ranch became more efficient and sustainable than it had ever been, capable of surviving future droughts with minimal losses. More importantly, Cole's relationship with the Apache community had transformed him from an isolated settler into part of an extended network of mutual support and shared knowledge. He'd become a bridge between worlds that had traditionally viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. News of the unusual relationship between Cole and the local Apache band inevitably reached the attention of territorial authorities, who arrived at his ranch in late summer to investigate reports of irregular contact between a white settler and hostile Indians. The investigation team was led by Captain Harrison, a cavalry officer who'd spent his career fighting Indian wars and had little sympathy for what he saw as collaboration with the enemy. "Mr. Mackenzie," Captain Harrison announced as his small patrol surrounded Cole's cabin, "we've received reports that you've been providing aid and comfort to Apache raiders. This is a serious charge that could result in criminal prosecution." Cole received the investigators with the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. "Captain, I've been learning from my Apache neighbors how to ranch more effectively in desert conditions. If that's a crime, then I suppose you'll have to arrest me." The investigation that followed revealed the extent of Cole's transformation from struggling rancher to successful desert farmer. His cattle were healthier than those on most neighboring ranches. His water conservation methods were more sophisticated than anything the cavalry had encountered, and his understanding of local conditions was remarkably advanced. "Where did you learn these techniques?" Captain Harrison asked, as he examined Cole's innovative irrigation system and water storage facilities. "From people who've been practicing them successfully for centuries," Cole replied diplomatically. "The Apache have been living in this country long enough to understand how to work with its natural limitations." Eagle Feather arrived during the investigation, accompanied by several tribal elders who wanted to ensure that Cole wasn't being punished for his friendship with their people. The chief's dignity and obvious intelligence made it difficult for the cavalry officers to maintain their preconceptions about Indian capabilities. "This man saved the life of my granddaughter when she was dying in the desert," Eagle Feather explained, with formal courtesy. "In return, we have shared knowledge that has helped him survive the great drought. This is the way honorable people behave toward each other." Captain Harrison found himself in the awkward position of trying to condemn a relationship that was clearly beneficial to everyone involved and violated no federal laws or territorial regulations. The Apache weren't reservation Indians subject to movement restrictions. Cole wasn't providing weapons or military intelligence, and their cooperation was focused entirely on agricultural and survival techniques. The official report that resulted from the investigation actually praised Cole's innovations as an example of successful adaptation to frontier conditions. The water conservation methods he'd learned were recommended for adoption by other ranchers, while his cooperative relationship with local Indians was held up as a model for peaceful coexistence. But the investigation had an unintended consequence that would expand the influence of Cole's example throughout the territory. Government agricultural agents began visiting his ranch to study the techniques he'd learned, and word spread among struggling ranchers that there might be alternatives to the conventional approaches that were failing during the drought. Dr. William Patterson, a professor of agriculture from the Territorial University, spent a week documenting Cole's methods and interviewing Apache elders about traditional water management practices. His subsequent report, published in scientific journals, brought national attention to the innovative approaches being developed in New Mexico. The integration of traditional Native American agricultural knowledge with European American ranching techniques has produced remarkable results, Dr. Patterson wrote. This collaboration represents a new model for sustainable development in arid regions that could influence farming practices throughout the American West. The academic recognition led to government funding for expanded cooperation between white settlers and Indian communities throughout the region. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, traditionally focused on policies of separation and control, began exploring ways to encourage productive partnerships that benefited both communities. The success of Cole's partnership with the Apache community attracted visitors from throughout the Southwest, transforming his modest ranch into an informal research center where traditional knowledge and modern techniques were combined in innovative ways. Agricultural experts, government officials, and struggling ranchers arrived regularly to learn about water conservation methods that seemed almost miraculous in their effectiveness. But it was the social dimension of the cooperation that impressed visitors most. The relationship between Cole and Eagle Feather's band had evolved into something approaching extended family, with regular social gatherings, shared celebration of important events, and mutual assistance that went far beyond the original arrangements surrounding the sacred spring. What we've created here is more than just a successful ranching operation. Cole explained to a group of territorial officials who'd come to study his methods. We've created a community that transcends the artificial boundaries that usually separate different peoples. Aiyana, now approaching her 10th birthday, and had become fluent in both English and Apache, while serving as an unofficial cultural interpreter for visitors who wanted to understand the traditional knowledge that had made Cole's ranch so successful. Her ability to move between both worlds symbolized the kind of integration that was becoming possible through respectful cooperation. The drought that had brought Cole and Eagle Feather's people together had ended, but their partnership continued to evolve and expand. They'd established joint grazing areas where Apache horses and Cole's cattle shared rangeland, developed trading relationships that benefited both communities, and created educational programs that taught young people from both cultures about sustainable land management. The drought taught us that we're stronger together than apart, Eagle Feather observed during a gathering that celebrated the 5th anniversary of Aiyana's rescue. When the land was dying, cooperation kept us all alive. Now that the rains have returned, cooperation makes us all prosperous. The sacred spring that had saved Cole's ranch during the worst of the drought remained a secret known only to a select few, but its influence had spread far beyond its physical location. The principles of water conservation and respect for natural resources that it represented had been adopted by ranchers and farmers throughout the territory. Cole had become one of the most successful ranchers in New Mexico, but more importantly, he'd become a bridge between communities that had traditionally viewed each other as enemies. His ranch served as neutral ground where Apache and white families could meet, trade, and learn from each other without the suspicions that characterized most cross-cultural interactions. The children who grew up around Cole's ranch were bilingual and bicultural, comfortable moving between Apache and Anglo communities while serving as natural ambassadors for continued cooperation. They represented the future that visionaries like Eagle Feather and Cole had been working toward, a generation that saw diversity as strength rather than division as necessity. Uncle Cole taught me that water is sacred, Aiyana said during a speech at the territorial capital, where she'd been invited to speak about the cooperative programs that had grown from her rescue. But he also taught me that people of different colors can be family if they choose to respect and help each other. The techniques that Cole had learned from the Apache were being taught at agricultural colleges throughout the country, while the social model of their cooperation was influencing government policies toward Indian relations. Officials who visited Cole's ranch found it difficult to maintain traditional assumptions about the impossibility of peaceful coexistence. By 1895, the cooperative model that had grown from Cole's protection of Aiyana and the Apache response during the drought had expanded throughout the New Mexico territory and into surrounding regions. What had begun as a simple case of neighbors helping neighbors had evolved into a systematic approach to resource management and community development that was being studied by experts from around the world. The ranch that Cole had almost lost to drought had become one of the most successful operations in the Southwest, but its importance went far beyond individual prosperity. It had become a demonstration site where traditional Apache knowledge and modern ranching techniques were combined to create sustainable approaches to desert agriculture. Cole, now in his late 40s and recognized as one of the territory's leading experts on arid land management, often reflected on the chain of events that had transformed his life so completely. A simple act of kindness toward a lost child had led to relationships and knowledge that had not only saved his ranch but had influenced the development of an entire region. When I found Aiyana dying in the desert, Cole said during a speech at the Territorial University, I was just doing what any decent person would do. I never imagined that helping one child would lead to learning from her people and building something that would benefit so many others. Eagle Feather, despite being well into his 80s, remained active in promoting cooperative projects throughout the region. His combination of traditional wisdom and practical innovation had made him one of the most respected leaders in the territory, consulted by officials and business leaders who valued his insights about sustainable development. The sacred spring that had provided Cole with water during the drought remained protected and secret, known only to a trusted few who understood the importance of preserving such resources for future generations. But its influence had spread through the knowledge and techniques that it had made possible to share. Aiyana, now a young woman of 16, had become one of the most effective advocates for continued cooperation between Apache and white communities. Her education in both cultures, combined with her personal experience of being saved by cross-cultural kindness, made her a powerful voice for continued integration and mutual respect. The drought that almost killed me as a child became the beginning of something beautiful, she said during a graduation ceremony at the school that had been established to teach integrated approaches to desert living. It showed us that when people of different backgrounds work together, they can survive anything and create prosperity that benefits everyone. The educational programs that had grown from Cole's ranch were producing a generation of young people who were fluent in both Anglo and Apache approaches to land management, capable of serving as leaders in the continuing development of the American Southwest. More importantly, these young people had grown up seeing cooperation rather than conflict as the normal state of relations between different communities. They carried forward the lessons that Cole and Eagle Feather had demonstrated, that diversity of knowledge and experience made everyone stronger, and that mutual respect could overcome even the deepest cultural divisions. The water conservation techniques that had saved Cole's ranch were being used by farmers and ranchers from California to Texas, proving their effectiveness in a variety of climatic conditions. The social techniques that had enabled such effective cooperation were being studied by government officials and community leaders who wanted to replicate similar partnerships in their own regions. What we learned during the drought, Cole observed during an interview with a writer documenting the history of the cooperative movement, is that survival isn't about individual toughness or superior technology. It's about building relationships strong enough to share resources and knowledge when they're most needed. As the 19th century drew to a close, the transformation that had begun with Cole's protection of a lost Apache child and the tribe's response during the drought had influenced the development of the entire American Southwest. The cooperative model pioneered in New Mexico had been adapted to different conditions and communities throughout the region, proving that the principles of mutual assistance and cultural integration could work in various circumstances. Cole, now recognized as one of the territory's most successful ranchers and most influential community leaders, had achieved prosperity beyond anything he'd imagined during those desperate drought years. But more importantly, he'd become part of an extended family that transcended racial boundaries and cultural differences. The ranch that drought had nearly destroyed had become a thriving operation that employed people from multiple communities and served as a training center where traditional knowledge and modern techniques were combined to create sustainable approaches to desert living. The techniques developed there were being taught at universities throughout the country. Eagle Feather lived to be 93, spending his final years as a revered elder whose wisdom was sought by leaders from both Apache and white communities. His vision of cooperation between peoples had been realized in ways that exceeded even his optimistic expectations, creating a legacy that would influence the region for generations to come. "The child we saved became the bridge between our worlds," the old chief said during his final visit to Cole's ranch. "But the real bridge was built by all of us working together, learning from each other, and choosing to see our differences as gifts rather than threats." Aiyana grew up to become a teacher and cultural liaison, helping to establish schools throughout the Southwest that taught integrated approaches to education and community development. Her ability to move between different worlds and translate between different ways of thinking made her one of the most effective advocates for continued cooperation. The sacred spring that had saved Cole's ranch during the drought continued to flow, protected by generations of people who understood its importance and maintained the traditions that preserved its purity. It remained a symbol of what was possible when people approached natural resources with respect and wisdom, rather than exploitation and greed. When Cole died peacefully at the age of 74, his funeral was attended by over 2,000 people representing dozens of different communities throughout the Southwest. Apache and white families sat together to honor a man who'd shown them that kindness could be repaid in ways that created lasting prosperity for everyone involved. The eulogy was delivered by Aiyana's son, a young man whose mixed heritage symbolized the integrated community that had grown from his grandmother's rescue decades earlier. "He taught us that protecting one child could save an entire community," the young man said, "and that accepting help from people who look different can create relationships that sustain us through any crisis." The ranch that Cole had built continued to operate under the management of the extended family that had grown from his partnership with Eagle Feather's people. It remained a demonstration site where visitors could learn about sustainable approaches to desert living and see evidence that cooperation between different communities was not only possible but profoundly beneficial. Modern agricultural experts who studied Cole's legacy noted that the techniques he'd learned from the Apache were remarkably similar to methods being developed by contemporary environmental scientists. Traditional knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive had proven to be sophisticated understanding of complex ecological relationships. But perhaps the most important legacy was the proof that individual acts of kindness could create ripples of positive change that influenced entire regions. Cole's decision to save a dying child had led to relationships that transformed not just his own life but the lives of countless others who benefited from the cooperative networks that grew from that simple act of compassion. The drought that had nearly destroyed Cole's ranch had become the catalyst for innovations that made the entire Southwest more resilient and sustainable. When future droughts came, communities had the knowledge and relationships necessary to weather them successfully, proving that crisis could indeed become opportunity when people chose cooperation over competition. And sometimes, on quiet desert evenings when the wind whispered through the cottonwoods that grew around the sacred spring, visitors swore they could still hear the voices of Cole and Eaglefeather discussing their plans for the future. Two old friends whose partnership had proven that even in the harshest landscape, acts of kindness could create oases of hope that would flourish for generations to come. In the end, the cowboy who protected a tribal child had discovered that the greatest treasure wasn't water or land or cattle. It was the relationships that transformed strangers into family and made survival possible through cooperation, mutual respect, and the recognition that in times of crisis, we all depend on the kindness of others to see us through to better days.